My wife said she needed space, then went on a month-long trip with her friends and left me alone with our newborn son. When she finally came back, what she saw made her gasp. No, no, this can't be happening. But before I begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. And we'd love to hear which part of the world are you joining us from. Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. The rain came down in slow, steady sheets across Tacoma that Tuesday evening. It tapped against the windows like quiet fingers, the kind of rain that fills a house with a sense of being closed in, not noisy but present, the way certain silences are present. Robert Mercer stood near the couch in the living room, his 6-week-old son pressed gently against his chest. Noah smelled like warm milk and talcum powder, and despite everything happening around him, Robert kept one hand flat on the baby's back, moving in slow circles the way he'd taught himself to do over the past few weeks. Jessica was at the other end of the room, pulling clothes from a chair near the window and folding them into a large suitcase laid open across the floor. She moved with a quiet efficiency that caught him off guard. Not frantic, not guilty, just efficient, the way a person looks when the decision has already been made and all that remains is to follow through on it. Robert had seen the signs building over the past week. The way she angled her phone away when a message arrived. The nights of shallow, restless sleep beside him, her body turned toward the wall. The conversations that drifted toward things she needed, air, time, space, words that didn't resolve into anything concrete when he tried to hold them. He'd asked her once, gently, whether something was wrong. She'd said no, that she was fine, and then gone to bed before 9. He hadn't pushed. He'd watched, and he'd waited. He was good at that. He ran a garage, and a garage teaches patience more than almost anything else does. You learn to observe before you act, to listen to the engine before you reach for the wrench. He'd extended the same courtesy to his marriage. Now here they were. "I can't do this right now," Jessica said without looking at him. She pressed a folded sweater into the corner of the case. "I need space before I lose myself." Robert looked at her steadily. The words weren't entirely new. He'd heard variations of them across the past weeks, scattered through conversations like fragments of something she hadn't wanted him to piece together too soon. "You already have a child," he said. His voice stayed even. He kept it that way deliberately. "That changes things." She straightened slightly and let out a careful breath through her nose. "I didn't say I'm leaving forever. Just a few weeks. I just need to breathe." "A few weeks," he repeated. "Yes." She reached for her phone on the side table and slid it into her jacket pocket. The motion was practiced, automatic. "I'm not abandoning anyone. I just need a minute to find myself again." Robert looked down at Noah. The baby had fallen asleep against his shoulder, head tilted slightly to one side, lips parted in that unconscious ease that newborns have. 6 weeks old, he still had the particular softness of a new baby, the kind that slows people mid-sentence, that pulls adults out of themselves without warning. Robert thought about this tiny person who had arrived, knowing nothing about the arguments and the tension and the quietly unraveling things around him. He thought about what 6 weeks old actually meant. "Then go," Robert said quietly. Not softly. There was a difference. Jessica zipped the suitcase. The sound cut across the room. "But understand something," he added. "Life doesn't pause while you figure yourself out." She didn't answer that. She grabbed the suitcase handle, pulled it upright on its wheels, and walked to the front door. She paused there with her hand on the knob, and Robert thought for a moment she might turn around. Might look at her son at least. Might say something that gave this moment any weight beyond the purely practical. She didn't. The door clicked behind her. Outside, the rain kept falling. Robert stood in the middle of the room for a long moment. Noah made a small sound against his shoulder. Not crying, just the involuntary breath of a baby shifting in deep sleep. Robert adjusted him, resettled his weight, and walked to the window. He watched the headlights of Jessica's car back out of the driveway and disappear down the wet street, red taillights blurring in the rain until they were gone. He'd always known, somewhere below the surface of things, that she wasn't ready for this. He'd known it at the baby shower, when she'd laughed a little too freely about freedom, when the car ride home had been quiet in the wrong way. He'd told himself it was nerves, that it was stress, that the weight of a new thing sometimes pressed down before it lifted. He told himself this would pass. Some things don't pass. Some things are just what they are, and you live with them until you can't. He looked at his son. Something settled in his chest. Not peace exactly, and not surrender either. More like the sensation of standing on solid ground after a long stretch of uncertain footing. Whatever came next, he was still here. Noah was still here. And that was the only thing that actually mattered tonight. The first night alone was worse than he'd expected, and he'd expected it to be bad. Noah screamed from 11 at night until nearly 3 in the morning. Robert moved through every technique he'd learned. The slow rocking, the warm feeding, the measured walk up and down the hallway with the lights dimmed to almost nothing. He changed the diaper twice just to rule it out. He tried running the bathroom shower hot and sitting on the floor with the steam rising, because he'd read somewhere that the warmth could help. He hummed a song he half remembered from childhood, something his mother used to sing that he could no longer recall the words to. He tried the white noise app on his phone. He tried the absence of all sound. Nothing worked for a long time. Around 2:30 in the morning, Noah simply wore himself out. He went from a full, ragged cry to a thin whimper to a stuttered exhale, and then his body went slack and heavy on Robert's shoulder, the complete surrender of a baby who has run out of reasons to keep going. Robert lowered himself to the couch with extreme care and sat in the dark with his son against his chest, afraid to shift his weight. He was at the garage by 7 that morning. He ran Mercer Auto on Yakima Avenue, a 5-bay shop he'd built up over 6 years from a 2-bay operation with a second-hand lift and a customer list he could fit on one page. He had 2 full-time mechanics, Denny, who was 52 and had forgotten more about engines than most people ever learned, and Craig, who was 28 and quick with diagnostics. Becca came in 3 days a week to handle the phones and the billing, and she did it well enough that Robert rarely had to think about that side of things. It wasn't a large business, but it was his in the way that things are yours when you've built them with your own hands and your own money and your own sustained attention. He brought Noah in a car seat that first day and sat on the desk in the office off the main floor. Becca looked at the baby and then at Robert and said, "Are you doing okay?" He told her yes. She didn't believe him, but she had the sense not to press it. The days that followed had a brutal rhythm to them. Up before 6. Feed Noah. Get dressed, get Noah dressed. Drive to the garage. Work a full day. Drive home. Feed Noah again. Eat something himself, usually standing over the sink, because sitting down felt like a concession he couldn't afford. Bathe Noah. Rock him down. Lie on top of the covers fully clothed. Wake at 2. Feed him again. Back down until 5:30. Repeat. He made mistakes in those first days. He burned 2 bottles because he forgot them on the burner when Noah started crying, and there was only one of him to respond to either emergency. He missed a nap window once and spent 3 hours paying for it that afternoon. He accidentally assembled a bottle without the liner one morning at 4 a.m. and fed Noah 3 full ounces of air before he worked out why the baby wasn't settling. He put a onesie on backwards at 3 in the morning and didn't notice until Becca mentioned it at noon the next day, at which point he'd already been to the pediatrician and 2 customers. But he learned. Every mistake happened once, and then he solved it. He started pre-measuring bottles and lining them up in the fridge so the feeding time shortened. He learned Noah had a precise window, roughly 22 minutes after his last feed, when he would go down almost without effort if the room was dark and quiet. He learned that Noah responded better to the weight of a steady hand on his chest than to rocking, which was counterintuitive and also completely reliable. He learned which cry was hunger and which was gas, and which was just a particular complaint of a baby who needed to be held, not fixed. He was getting better at it. Slowly, sometimes painfully, but consistently. Across the street, in the house the Garcia family had sold 8 months earlier, lived a woman named Marisol Vega. She was a registered nurse at Tacoma General, early 30s, with sharp dark eyes and the composed, unhurried way of moving through the world that nurses develop after years of managing real emergencies, the ability to distinguish between what is actually urgent and what only feels that way. They'd exchanged a few words over the months since she moved in, the kind of brief, friendly exchanges that happen in the mailbox or across a fence, enough to know each other's names and general outlines, but nothing more than that. She noticed things. On the fourth day, she saw Robert standing on his front porch at 7 in the evening, holding Noah in one arm and his phone in the other, wearing the expression of a man trying to search for help while the problem was actively in progress. She watched from her driveway for a moment. Then she walked across the street. "You haven't slept," she said. It was not a question. Robert gave a tired half-smile. "Is it that obvious? Your shirt's inside out." He looked down. It was. She asked if she could come in. He stepped back. She went straight to the kitchen sink and washed her hands without being asked, the automatic practice motion of someone for whom hand-washing is reflex, then dried them on the dish towel and came back to where he was standing near the living room. "May I?" She held her arms out slightly. He handed Noah over. She took him with the ease of someone who had done this hundreds of times, one hand cradling the back of his head, the other supporting him from beneath, and within 30 seconds the full, ragged crying had dropped to a low, uncertain whimper, and then to intermittent sounds, and then to near silence. "Sit," she told Robert. He sat at the kitchen table and realized he hadn't sat down voluntarily all day. She moved around the kitchen slowly while she held the baby, not speaking, just letting Noah adjust to the change in rhythm. After a few minutes, she settled in the chair across from Robert and asked him to show her how he'd been doing the feedings. He showed her. She watched, and then she talked him through a better angle for the bottle, a more effective burping position, a timing rhythm for the feeds that would reduce the gas that was clearly making Noah uncomfortable between meals. She spoke to him the way a good teacher does, directly, without softening it into condescension, treating him as someone capable of learning rather than someone who had already failed. She didn't stay long that first night. She handed Noah back, told Robert to get some sleep while he could, and left. She came back the next afternoon, and the day after that. She never made it complicated. That was the first thing Robert noticed, and kept noticing. She didn't linger past the point where she was actually useful. She didn't ask about Jessica, not once, even though the absence of a second parent in a house with a newborn was exactly the kind of gap that invites questions. She didn't try to steer conversations in directions that gave her information. She came over because there was something practical to offer. She offered it, and when it was done, she went home. She brought food once when she'd made extra, and he clearly hadn't eaten. She said, "You need fuel," set the dish on the counter, and left. He respected that more than he would have respected anything else she could have offered him. There was a night in the second week when Noah developed a fever. It came on quickly, sometime after midnight. Robert noticed the warmth when he went in for the 2 a.m. feed, the slight flush of the baby's cheeks, the way his breathing seemed faster and more effortful than usual. He knew what a mild fever was. He knew what to watch for. But alone in the dark at 2 in the morning with a 6-week-old running a temperature, all that knowledge felt thin in a way that theoretical knowledge often does when the situation becomes real. He texted Marisol. She was at his door in 8 minutes. She came in quietly, didn't make a show of it, went straight to Noah, and checked everything with the efficient, systematic calm of someone who had assessed genuinely sick children in a hospital setting and understood the difference between concerning and critical. She explained what she was seeing, what was normal, what would warrant a trip to the emergency room. She stayed for 2 hours, keeping Robert company while he took the temperature every 30 minutes with the thermometer she showed him how to use correctly. And when the fever broke just after 2 a.m. and Noah relaxed into a deep, steady sleep, she said he's going to be fine. Get some rest. And went home. He sent her a message in the morning that just said thank you. She replied, "That's what neighbors are for." Robert turned that over in his mind in the days that followed. He thought about what she'd said and what she'd done, and how little they resembled each other in kind. Showing up at 2 in the morning for a neighbor's sick baby was not what neighbors were generally for. But Marisol said it without any sense of performing generosity, which was exactly what made it feel genuine. He noticed, in those weeks, that she had a quality he'd always valued in the people he trusted most, but rarely named directly. She showed up, not dramatically, not with a lot of noise or expectation around it. She simply appeared when something needed doing and stepped back when it didn't. She didn't require gratitude in any visible form. She didn't need to be acknowledged beyond a simple thank you. She didn't leave a debt hanging in the air. He thought about that quality a lot in those late nights, when Noah was finally asleep and the house was quiet. He'd always taken it for granted in reliable people and only noticed its absence in the ones who weren't. Now, in a very specific and concrete way, he understood what it looked like when someone chose not to show up. He could feel the shape of that absence every morning when he woke alone and the house was quiet in the wrong way. About 2 weeks in, on a quiet Thursday evening, Marisol was sitting at the kitchen table reading something on her phone while Robert gave Noah a bottle. The house was dim except for the lamp above the stove, and rain was moving through again outside. The same slow Tacoma rain that had been present the night Jessica left, as though the city itself was running the same program on a loop. "You're more confident than you were," Marisol said. She wasn't looking up from her phone. Robert glanced across at her. "You say that like it surprises you." "It doesn't," she said. "I just thought you should hear it." He looked at his son. Noah had developed a habit of staring at Robert's face while he ate, an unblinking, unfocused gaze that was still more sensory impression than recognition, but was gradually becoming something else. Robert could feel it changing day by day. The way the baby tracked the sound of his voice before he could track the face, the way he settled differently now when Robert was the one doing the holding. "I didn't know I could do this," Robert said. It wasn't a complaint. It was just the honest observation of a man who had discovered a competence in himself he hadn't known was there. Marisol set her phone down and looked at him. Most people don't know until they have to. He thought about that. Then he looked at Noah again, at the steady way the baby watched him, and something quiet and warm settled in the center of his chest. He was doing this. One day at a time, one problem at a time, he was doing this. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, just after 4. Robert was underneath a customer's truck, running a diagnosis on the exhaust system, when his phone buzzed on the concrete beside him. He slid out, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and saw the name on the screen, Caleb Rourke. Caleb was an old friend from Robert's early 20s, one of those people who had never quite graduated from that era, still moving between cities, still picking up work wherever it presented itself, still living with the particular lightness of someone who hadn't accumulated enough to lose. He'd been down in San Diego for the past several months, doing something that involved construction equipment in a company he described vaguely as a solid gig. They talked maybe 4 times a year, never about anything particularly important. The voice on the phone was careful in a way that Caleb's voice rarely was. "Hey," he said, "do you have a minute?" Robert stepped away from the truck and walked toward the back office. "Yeah, what is it?" "I saw Jessica." The garage noise continued around him. Craig running an impact wrenched 2 bays over, the radio on low, the hiss of the air compressor cycling. Robert went into the office and pulled the door, closed behind him. "Where?" he asked. "San Diego. Downtown. Saturday night. And then I saw her again on Monday afternoon." "Okay." Caleb paused. "She wasn't alone, Robert." "Okay. Not just, it wasn't the same guy. Both times." Another pause. A longer one. "And I could see the name on her card when she paid. It was yours. Your name, the joint account." The office was small and warm. Robert pulled out the chair behind the desk and sat down. Through the wall, he could hear the faint sound of the radio, some oldie station Denny kept on all day. The songs changed, but the rhythm of the day stayed the same. He thought about all the times over the past few weeks he'd explained Jessica's absence at the garage and in conversations with people who asked. Just taking some time. She needed a break after the baby. It happens. He'd said these things and let them stand because they were easier than the truth he'd felt accumulating under the surface. "Is there anything you can send me?" Robert asked. "I took some pictures," Caleb said. "It didn't feel right not to. I wasn't sure what to do with them." "Send everything you have." There was a short silence. "I'm sorry, man. I genuinely didn't know what to do with this." "You did the right thing," Robert said. "Send it all." He hung up and sat quietly in the office for a moment. The thing he noticed most was that he didn't feel shocked. He'd expected to feel something more violent, a rupture of some kind, the sensation of a floor dropping. Instead, there was a strange, almost clinical stillness. The kind that follows not when something breaks you open, but when something you'd already suspected is finally confirmed. Not relief, not grief, Something more like the moment a diagnosis arrives after a long period of uncertainty. It doesn't feel good, but at least now you know what you're actually dealing with. He sat for 3 minutes. He checked the clock and counted, and then he stood up, walked back out onto the floor, and finished the diagnosis on the exhaust system. The photos arrived 2 hours later. He opened them at the kitchen table after Noah was down for the night. The house quiet around him except for the low hum of the white noise machine from down the hall. He went through each image the way he approached a complex engine problem, methodically, without letting his hands or his face react before his mind had finished working. The photos were clear. Jessica at a rooftop bar in what looked like the Gaslamp Quarter, laughing easily with a man Robert didn't recognize, close in the way people are when there's no reason to maintain any distance. A second image from later the same night, slightly blurred but distinct enough in what it showed. Then the Monday afternoon images, taken from across a restaurant terrace. Jessica at lunch with someone different, her hand resting near his on the table. The whole posture of the scene relaxed and unhurried and utterly at odds with the woman who had told Robert she needed a few weeks to find herself before she lost everything. He closed out of the photos and opened his bank application. The charges were laid out in plain, datable lines. Hotel rooms on 4 separate nights. Restaurant bills that ran to 3 figures. Ride shares between addresses in downtown San Diego. Bar tabs. A day spa. A boutique dress shop. Across the 3 weeks she'd been gone, she'd spent a figure that would have covered Noah's pediatric costs for the next 2 months. He put the phone face down on the table. He sat in the quiet for a while. From Noah's room came the steady, low sound of the white noise machine, consistent and neutral. The rain had stopped earlier in the evening, and the house was dry and still. He thought about Jessica at the bar in that photo, the particular ease of her posture, the way she looked like herself in a way she hadn't looked in months before she left. Maybe longer than that. He got up. He went to the filing cabinet in the second bedroom, the one that held his business papers, the insurance records, the property documents. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and sat back down at the table. Then he started writing. He separated the finances first. He called the bank and kept his voice level and neutral. And within 20 minutes, he'd had his name removed from the shared account, had the card flagged, and had moved the remaining balance into an account Jessica had no access to. He did it without anger, the way you close a valve when a pipe is leaking. Not because you're furious at the pipe, but because the right response to a leak is to stop it. In the morning, before the garage opened, he pulled out the business card for Hal Gunderson, the family attorney he'd done work for 2 summers back. Gunderson had replaced his brake lines and needed a new alternator, and they'd had a few conversations over coffee while he waited, the kind of conversations where you learn more about a person's mind than their biography. Robert had liked the way the man thought. He was precise and unsentimental, and he spoke about the law the way Robert spoke about engines, as a system with rules that could be understood and applied. He made the appointment. That evening, after Denny locked the garage and Robert had collected Noah and come home and put him down for the night, he sat at the kitchen table again and worked through everything he needed to document. Every expense he'd covered since Noah's birth. Every night he'd been the primary caretaker. Dates, times, notes on what Noah had needed and what Robert had done. The pediatric visit records, all in his name because he was the one who had taken the baby. The credit card statements with the San Diego charges highlighted. He did this without bitterness. Bitterness was a cost he couldn't afford. It made you sloppy. It made you emotional, and it handed the other side leverage they hadn't earned. He did it because it was necessary, because his son was here and Robert was the one who had stayed, and because he had no interest in letting the next decade of his life be shaped by someone else's decisions made without his input. When he closed the notepad, it was past 11. He checked on Noah before bed. The baby was on his back the way he always slept, both arms thrown wide, face open and slack in the nightlight. Robert stood in the doorway for a long moment and watched the small, steady rise and fall of his son's chest. Then he went to bed. The weeks that followed were the quietest of Robert's adult life. Not empty. The garage kept him busy, Noah kept him constantly occupied, and the legal work with Gunderson had its own pace and demands. But quiet in the way a house is after something that was generating a lot of low-level noise finally stops. He hadn't realized how much of his mental energy had been spent on a sustained, low-grade vigilance, watching for signs, interpreting moods, bracing, until the need for it was gone. He met with Gunderson twice in the first week. The attorney reviewed everything Robert had brought, asked four sharp questions, and told him he had a strong case for primary custody. He explained the process, the timeline, what to expect, and when. Robert listened carefully and took notes on a small pad he kept in his jacket pocket, the same one he used at the garage when a customer described symptoms he wanted to remember exactly. They filed for divorce on a Tuesday morning. Robert drove to the garage afterward and worked a full 8-hour shift. He didn't tell anyone immediately. Not Becca, not Denny, not his brother in Portland who would have strong opinions delivered a volume. He didn't need the sympathy, and he genuinely didn't need the opinions. He needed the work to be done, and it was getting done. That was enough. Marisol continued to be a steady presence through those weeks. She asked nothing and read the situation well. She could see that something had shifted in Robert. The particular quality of the tension that had threaded through the early weeks was gone now. He was quieter in a different register. Not numb, not suppressed, but grounded in a way he hadn't been when she'd first crossed the street to knock on his door. She mentioned it one evening, without making it a thing. "You're not surprised?" she said. She was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and Noah was in his seat between them, looking up at the hanging mobile above him with an expression of absolute focus. Robert looked at her. About what? Whatever happened. She left it there, open-ended and undemanding. He thought about it for a moment. "I stopped expecting anything from her a while ago," he said. "I just needed to know for certain." Marisol nodded once and didn't ask anything more. She understood the kind of answer that was also a door, and she had the grace to leave it closed. Noah was growing in a way that seemed to accelerate with each passing week. His cheeks were filling out, the newborn thinness giving way to something more substantial. His eyes were focusing with increasing clarity. He could track movement now, could turn toward a voice, could fix on a face, and hold it there with an intensity that was almost startling. He had begun making sounds that weren't crying. Small, exploratory noises, vowel sounds that seemed to surprise him when they came out, as though he'd discovered a mechanism he hadn't known he had. He'd grabbed Robert's finger one morning with a grip that was stronger than expected and held on, and Robert had laughed out loud in the empty kitchen. A real laugh, not the polite social kind, but the unguarded sound of a person who has been genuinely caught off guard by something good. He was a father. Whatever else was true or uncertain or painful, that was true and certain and good. One evening near the end of the second month, Marisol was sitting in the armchair in the living room with Noah asleep in her arms. She'd stayed a little later than usual because Craig had called Robert with a complicated question about a transmission rebuild, and Robert had needed 20 minutes to talk him through it. When he came back into the room, Marisol looked up from Noah's face and then back down at him and said softly, "But doing everything right." Robert sat down on the couch. He looked at his son, the complete, unguarded trust of a baby in deep sleep, the soft weight of it, the way it communicated something that words between adults rarely managed. "No," he said, "I'm just doing what she chose not to." The room was quiet around them. Outside, the street was dark and still. That was the honest truth of it. He hadn't risen to some exceptional standard. He hadn't discovered reserves of heroism he hadn't known he possessed. He'd just been present for the feeding at 3 in the morning and the ear infection in week 4 and the long Sunday afternoon when Noah cried for 3 hours and Robert tried everything he knew and some things he invented and eventually just sat on the bathroom floor and held his son until the crying ran out. He'd been there for all of it. The bar wasn't high. He'd just been the only one willing to step over it. The moment she came back on a Thursday afternoon, 31 days after she'd left, Robert was in the kitchen making a bottle when he heard the front door. He knew that door, knew the specific click of its latch, the particular drag across the weather stripping that had never quite been fixed, the way the hinges made a sound he didn't notice until it was quiet enough to hear it. He set the bottle down on the counter. He heard her footsteps come inside and then stop. He stepped out of the kitchen into the hallway and saw her standing just past the threshold, suitcase beside her, one hand still resting on the handle. She'd come straight in, the way she used to when she lived here, and the door had been unlocked because it was the middle of the afternoon and he rarely locked it then. She looked rested. There was a lightness to her that contrasted sharply with everything about the last few months before she'd left. Her hair had something different done to it, lighter at the ends, deliberate and styled. Her clothes were things he didn't recognize, something newer and better fitted than what she'd packed. She'd been gone 31 days, and she looked like someone returning from a trip she'd enjoyed. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Marisol. Marisol was in the living room, standing near the window with Noah in her arms, rocking him gently in the slow, rhythmic way she'd developed over the weeks. She'd stopped by after a morning shift, as she did a few times each week, and she'd stayed for lunch and was still there, comfortable in the quiet of the early afternoon. She had her back partly turned toward the hallway, looking down at Noah, unaware that anything had changed in the room. Then she felt the shift, the way a room's atmosphere changes when something enters it that hasn't been there before, and she turned slowly. The three of them were still for exactly one moment. Then Jessica's voice broke through it. "Who is that?" Robert walked fully into the living room. He was calm. He had been calm for weeks, not in a suppressed or effortful way, but in the way that follows when you've stopped waiting and started doing. There was nothing here that frightened him and nothing here that required explanation beyond what he was willing to offer. "That's Marisol," he said. "She helped when you didn't." Jessica's eyes moved between Marisol and Robert with a rapid, assessing quality. The look of someone trying to construct a story quickly and not finding the pieces where they expected them to be. Her arms had folded across her chest. He recognized the posture. It was what she did when she felt defensive and wanted to look like she felt something else. "You let a stranger take care of my baby?" Her voice had risen on the last word, the emphasis somewhere between disbelief and accusation. Marisol didn't argue. She didn't flinch. She looked at Jessica with an expression that was completely clear, not unkind, not hostile, just direct and unhurried. Then she shifted Noah gently from her shoulder and crossed the room and held him out to Robert. He took his son. Marisol took a quiet step back. "I'm not a stranger," she said. Her voice was even. "I'm someone who showed up." She said it the way she said most things, without performance, without waiting to see how it landed. She stated it the way a nurse states a blood pressure reading, plainly, because it was accurate. But it landed anyway. Robert watched it move across Jessica's face, the small, involuntary tightening around the jaw, the slight widening of the eyes that comes not from pain exactly, but from a sensation of something true connecting with something you've been working not to see. Jessica moved into the room slowly, in the way someone moves when they're trying to recover their footing. She looked around as though taking inventory. The room was different. Robert had reorganized things over the weeks she was gone. Not out of spite, but because he lived here and the house needed to function around a newborn. The decorative wall hanging she bought at the weekend market had come down when he needed that wall for Noah's feeding chart and the pediatric notes he wanted visible. The shelf near the window that she'd used for small displayed objects had been cleared to make room for supplies. The entry table with its little bowl of her personal items, spare lip balm, loose change, a keyring she never used, had been reorganized, its contents boxed up and moved to the second bedroom. Her presence in the room's arrangement was just not there anymore. She moved down the hallway. Robert heard the bedroom door open. He heard her footsteps stop. He'd move his things to the center of the closet, not as a statement, purely practically, the way a person does when they have an entire wardrobe to work with and no particular reason to keep half of it unused. Her clothes, still on their hangers, were in the second bedroom with the rest of the boxed items. He hadn't thrown anything away. He'd simply reorganized around the reality that only one person was living here. She came back out into the hallway and stood at the entrance to the living room. Her face had changed. "No," she said quietly, as though she were telling herself something. She walked further into the room, looking at the walls, at the corner where she used to keep a reading chair that Robert had moved to make room for the playmat. "No, this can't be happening." Robert held Noah against his shoulder. He met her eyes. "It already happened," he said. She stepped toward him. Her voice was edged now with something that moved between panic and anger, as though she couldn't decide which to commit to. You replaced me? Robert shook his head. No, you removed yourself. She stared at him for a moment. Then the familiar pivot arrived. He'd seen it in smaller conflict before, the shift to a different angle when the current one stopped working. Her expression changed slightly, went more careful, and her voice dropped in volume. I made mistakes, she said. I know that. I'm not saying I handled everything right, but I'm still his mother. Yes, Robert said, and I'm the one who stayed. She took a breath. I just needed some time. I was struggling, Robert. You don't know what I was going through. You're right that I don't know everything you're going through, he said, but I know what you were doing, and I know what it cost. She started to say something, and he cut through it, not loudly, but with a finality that closed the door on that angle. I know about San Diego, he said. The room went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a settled house, but the sudden, charged stillness of a space from which all other noise has been pulled out at once. Even Noah was still against Robert's shoulder, as though he could feel the change in the air. I know about the men, Robert continued. I know how many nights you were out and what the bills looked like when they came through. I know what you spent and where and on what while I was working 12-hour days and sleeping in blocks of 3 hours with a newborn at home. Jessica's face had gone pale. Her mouth opened and then closed. She looked, for the first time since she'd walked through that door, genuinely uncertain of what came next. Ow, she said finally. You went through my private. You left your accounts open, he said, and you weren't careful about who saw you. Silence moved through the room again. She tried once more, and he gave her credit for the effort, even if he had no intention of rewarding it. What I did in San Diego has nothing to do with Noah. I'm his mother. That's a fact that doesn't change regardless of any of this. No one's disputing that, Roberts said. But being someone's mother and having custody of them are two different things. And a judge is going to look at the facts. He handed Noah to Marisol. She took him without a word, stepping back slightly to give the room. Robert walked to the dining room table and picked up the folder from the stack of papers near the wall. Organized, dated, assembled over the past 3 weeks with the methodical care he applied to everything he needed to get right. He carried it back into the living room and held it out. Jessica looked at the folder. She didn't reach for it immediately, as though not taking it would change what was inside. What is that? Take it, he said. She took it. She opened the cover, and her eyes moved across the first page, and Robert watched the color leave her face in slow stages, like something draining out rather than being taken. You filed, she said. 3 weeks ago. She turned to the next page. Her hands had developed a slight tremor. Not dramatic, just the physical sign of a person processing something they had not prepared for and could not easily absorb. You can't do this without my knowledge. There are processes. You'll receive your formal copy by mail. My attorney will contact yours. Your attorney. The words came out slowly, like she was hearing them in a language she almost spoke. You have an attorney. I do. She looked down at the folder again, then across at Marisol, then back to Robert. The composure she'd walked in with, that easy, rested confidence of someone expecting to pick up where she'd left off, was completely gone. What replaced it was something rawer and less managed. The expression of a person whose plan has just stopped working and who hasn't yet built an alternate one. In her, she gestured toward Marisol, the motion sharp and small. You think she's better than me? You replaced me with a neighbor. Robert looked at his son, settled against Marisol's shoulder, content and unhurried. Then he looked back at Jessica. She didn't leave, he said. Jessica did not go quietly. He hadn't expected her to. She was not someone who accepted outcomes she hadn't chosen. And this outcome was one she'd never seen coming because she'd never bothered to imagine it as possible. She retained an attorney within the week, someone her sister recommended, a woman who had handled contested divorces and who apparently told Jessica she had arguments worth making. She filed responses. She made counterclaims. She contested the credit card evidence on the basis that the joint account had been accessible to both parties. She submitted a statement arguing that her absence had been a mental health necessity, a temporary period of recovery from postpartum stress, and that her fitness as a parent had never genuinely been in question. Robert sat in Gunderson's office and listened to all of this without changing his expression. "She's building noise," Gunderson told him, sorting through the papers with his usual measured economy of motion. "That's not the same thing as building a case." The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning. Robert wore his dark suit and brought 2 binders of documentation. Gunderson laid it out methodically. The date of Jessica's departure, the child's age at the time, the documented pattern of Robert's sole caregiving across the weeks that followed. The pediatric records with Robert listed as the attending parent. The financial statements. The photographs from San Diego, presented through Caleb's formal affidavit. The hotel charges, the spending pattern, the timeline of what was happening 3 states away while a newborn was home with 1 parent instead of 2. Jessica's attorney was skilled. She used language designed to soften the edges of the story. Postpartum adjustment, temporary crisis, documented recovery. She argued for Jessica's current fitness rather than her past conduct. She pressed where the record was thinner. She was not doing a poor job. But facts have a structural integrity that arguments don't. You can reframe an argument. You can't reframe a bank statement or a hotel check-in time. The judge was a quiet woman who listened to everything without visible reaction and asked 3 pointed questions at the end. 2 to Jessica's attorney and 1 directly to Jessica, who paused before answering it in a way that communicated exactly what the pause communicated. The ruling came down 10 days later. Primary custody was awarded to Robert. Jessica was granted visitation every other weekend and 1 weekday evening, with a supervised period during the initial months while a schedule was established. No alimony was awarded. Jessica was ordered to repay a portion of the misused funds, calculated from the documentation Robert had assembled. Robert read the ruling at the kitchen table with Noah in the bouncy seat beside him, kicking at the mobile above it with focused and energetic attention. He read every word carefully, all the way to the signature at the bottom, the way he read a completed repair order before he handed it to a customer. Then he set it down. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt something closer to the particular relief that comes after a long stretch of sustained effort finally produces the result it was aimed at. The outcome was not surprising. The facts had pointed here from the beginning, but there was still something in the confirmation of it that settled something in him. Jessica had left 2 voicemails after receiving her copy of the judgment. He listened to both completely, without skipping. They were variations on the same theme. This wasn't over. She would appeal. He had turned everything against her. Her voice in the messages had an exhausted quality that he found more honest than anything she'd said in person. He didn't call her back. He deleted the messages and made dinner. She didn't appeal. He'd expected she might sustain the fight longer. But fighting cost things that people who expected to win without effort often found harder to spend than they'd imagined. She'd assumed the courts would default to her. She'd assumed that Robert, as the father, would carry less weight than he did. She'd assumed the story she wanted to tell would be more durable than the record Robert had quietly been building. She'd been wrong about all of it. Robert understood that some version of this situation would go on for years. 2 parents, 1 child. The logistics of that arrangement would continue long after the ink dried on any document. There would be exchanges and scheduling conflicts, and, eventually, a conversation he'd need to figure out how to have with Noah when Noah was old enough to start asking the questions that children always eventually ask. He was not pretending those things would be easy. He was not under any illusion that it ended here. But right now, tonight, his son was in his bouncy seat, kicking happily at a mobile in a stable house with a father who had been present every single day. That was enough. It was a Friday evening in early December when Jessica came back to the street. Robert saw her from the kitchen window. He wasn't looking for her. He'd stopped doing that weeks ago, had stopped tracking the sound of cars on the street or the movement at the periphery of his attention. He was at the sink rinsing bottles, and when he glanced up, he saw the headlights of an unfamiliar car moving slowly down the block and coming to a stop at the curb across from the house. He could see her through the windshield. She was sitting still, the interior lit by the soft glow of the dashboard, looking at the house with an expression he couldn't read from this distance, but could feel somehow, the way you can feel when someone's attention is directed at you even when you can't see their face. He didn't go to the door. He didn't move away from the window, either. He finished rinsing the bottles and set them in the drying rack and dried his hands on the towel hanging from the oven handle. Behind him, Noah was in his bouncy seat at the kitchen table, making sounds. He was almost 3 months old now, and the sounds had evolved from the early wordless noises into something that suggested intention. Consonants that almost resolved into syllables, exploratory variations in pitch, the private experiment of a person discovering that his voice could do different things. Robert could spend 20 minutes just listening to it. Noah's features had sharpened slightly over the past weeks. The soft, unfocused roundness of a newborn stage was giving way to something more particular, more itself. A face that was becoming specific in a way that made Robert look at him each morning with a feeling of slightly stunned recognition. He didn't look like Robert exactly, and he didn't look like Jessica exactly, but he looked like himself in a way that was becoming more distinct every day. Robert watched for it. He kept watching for it. Marisol was at the kitchen table with a hospital chart she was reviewing before an early shift the next morning. She had a cup of tea beside her and her reading glasses on and the comfortable, unself-conscious ease of someone who feels genuinely at home in a place. She'd been coming over 3 or 4 evenings a week now, not just to help with Noah, though she still did that when it was needed, but because somewhere in the accumulated weeks of shared meals and quiet evenings and conversation that moved easily between topics, she had become a real presence in his life. Not a symbol of anything, not a statement about anything, just someone whose company he valued and who seemed to value his. She hadn't pushed the shape of what they were into any particular category. Neither had he. There was a kind of honesty in letting something be what it actually was rather than what you decided in advance it should be. He didn't say anything about the car outside. Marisol had her back to the window and didn't see it. Noah hadn't noticed anything beyond the fascinating business of making sounds with his own mouth. Outside, Jessica sat in the car for a long time. She could see through the kitchen window. The warm amber light, the ordinary domestic arrangement of the room. Robert near the sink, the lamp on the table, the baby in the bouncy seat. She could see Marisol's profile, the relaxed angle of her shoulders, the small smile she was making at something on the chart. She could see Noah's movement, the happy, energetic kicks. She had come back the first time expecting to find a man who was struggling and waiting. A man who had missed her in visible ways, who had found a month harder than he'd let on when she'd walked through the door, who would ultimately accept the shape of things returning to something like before because that was easier than confronting what she'd done. She'd been wrong about that, and she knew it now. She still wasn't entirely sure why she was here on this street at this hour, what she'd hoped to see or to feel. Maybe something like proof, some evidence that her absence had left a weight in that house proportional to the weight she'd placed on it in her own accounting. Some sign that Robert still moved around the space of her absence the way you move around a piece of furniture after it's been removed, carefully still mapping the space where the thing used to be. There was no such sign. The house wasn't organized around her absence. It wasn't grieving her. It had just continued, the way things continue when someone chooses to leave and someone else chooses to stay. She whispered something to herself in the dark of the car. She said something like, "This can't be real." But it was entirely real. And the realness of it wasn't cruel so much as it was complete. The gap she'd left had been filled, not with a replacement, not with a deliberate rebuke, but with the simple accumulation of days lived by a person who had decided to be present and had become, in that decision, exactly who his son needed. Inside, Robert dried his hands a second time and crossed the table and picked up Noah, who made a sound of mild surprise and then settled immediately. The particular settling of a baby who knows the hands that are holding him, who has built his sense of safety around a specific presence. He sat down across from Marisol. She glanced up from her chart and looked at Noah, and then at Robert, and gave a small, quiet smile, not a large or performed smile, but the smile of someone who is simply in the right place. Robert felt the warmth of the kitchen around him, the soft noise Noah was making, the ordinary, solid reality of the room. He didn't look at the window. He didn't need to. Outside, eventually headlights came on. The car pulled slowly away from the curb. The street was empty again. Inside, the kitchen was warm. The baby was awake and watching his father's face with the careful, devoted attention of someone who has already decided, without needing language for it, that this is the person he trusts most in the world. The lamp cast soft light across the table. The night moved on, because the truth was simple, and it required no defense and no further explanation. She had left. Someone else had stayed, and that had made all the difference.